Republican presidential candidate and Florida Senator Marco Rubio says Governor Scott Walker will be a big part of the GOP's future. As for the president, Rubio is not afraid to point out where he thinks Pope Francis is off target. I spoke with Rubio earlier today.
As a Catholic, the Pope is the vicar of Christ, the successor of Peter, the head of the church. And in theological matters, as a Catholic, I believe that when he pronounces himself from the chair of Peter, which actually is very rare, he's infallible in those decisions. That does not extend to political issues like the economy. On moral issues, he speaks with incredible authority, and he's done so consistently on the value of life, on the sanctity of life, on the importance of marriage, and on the family. On economic issues, the Pope is a person, and a head of state, the head of the Vatican, and he has opinions about economics. I see in the Pope's comments a fundamental misunderstanding about the difference between free enterprise and corporatism. In much of Latin America, where he's deeply rooted, the word capitalism basically means corporatism, which is these large companies connected to government dominate the society and dominate the economy. In America, free enterprise is something very different. It is a place where it doesn't matter if you have buddies that work in government or not. If you have a good idea and you're willing to work hard, you can get ahead. And the evidence is look around the world. Poor people do better in open societies with free enterprise than they do in societies where government dominates the economy. And so I have a difference of opinion with him on economic models. We have the same goal of providing more prosperity and upward mobility. I just honestly believe free enterprise is a better way of doing it.
And his encyclical on climate change?
Well, the Pope what he's asking us to do is be good stewards of the earth, and I understand that. Again, it goes back to how's the best way to do that. I don't believe these big government mandates that some on the left are pushing for will achieve it. On the contrary, I think it will actually set us back and make people poorer. I think the better approach is to allow innovation and competition and market forces to drive us in that direction, and the evidence is there. America has a cleaner environment than the Chinese do, which is a closed society and supposedly one that has, is still committed to the notion of communism. And in other parts of the world where the environment is very dirty, you'll notice that governments dominate those economies as well.
With your history with Cuba, all that you've said about Cuban policy, were you disappointed he didn't meet with dissidents?
Sure. I mean, look, I haven't talked to the Pope or anybody at the Vatican about why they chose to do that. I know that the church has worked very hard to create more space within Cuban society to operate. They now have been able to open a seminary. They've now been able to open some churches. Cuba was officially an atheist government up until the early 1990s, so there's been more space for the church to operate, and maybe they decided not to endanger that. But I am disappointed because there are people in Cuba that are fighting very hard and working very hard for more liberties, more freedoms, including religious liberties, and they were basically ignored, and I'm disappointed. I'm not going to attack the Pope over it, but I'm disappointed. Now, they claim the Pope called them, said he wanted to meet with them, and it was Cuban authorities who impeded that from happening. And ultimately, I think it was an opportunity for the world to see the true nature of this regime. They're not going to change a bit when it comes to freedom.
Another big visit this week, the Chinese president to the White House. In your view, has China declared cyber war on States? And if you're president, what would you do?
Well, a couple points, absolutely, but this is not new. They've done a number of things. They have non-tariff barriers set up for technology companies. Xi Jinping is going to be in Seattle today or tomorrow. He's going to be meeting with the heads of technology companies. And what they basically told technology companies is if you do business in China, you have to create a back door that gives us access to your data and to your software. In essence, the price of doing business in China is to turn over your intellectual property to them. That's a huge issue, long-term as well, because it could give them access to the information of Americans. They're no doubt conducting the most aggressive cyber operations against America of any group or country on the planet. As president, number one, we need to improve our cyber defenses by implementing the best practices, some of which are found in the private sector, are not shared with government. And that's why having a cyber bill passed is so critical. But the other is we have to improve our offensive cyber capabilities. The idea that there is a consequence and a price for conducting cyber attacks against American companies and against American government and against American individuals. Today there is no price for doing that, and so it's very easy for the Chinese to do it because they know we're not going to reciprocate. That needs to change, and that needs to be clear in our doctrine as well.
Is the Obama administration weak on China? Should they be instituting sanctions in the wake of this visit?
Well, they talked about that. They said they're going to sanction companies that have profited from American secrets. We'd like to see that happen. I think where they've been the weakest is on human rights. They talk about raising the issue, but it hasn't been prominent in bilateral discussions or in visits to China. I would love to see this president reach out to human rights activists in China. For even as the Chinese president is being feted here in Washington and greeted in official, forums, you have a Nobel Peace Prize winner sitting in jail. You have human rights lawyers that are missing, no one unaccounted for within China. If I'm president, I've said I will invite human rights activists from all over the world, including from China, to my inauguration as a clear message that America is once again on the right side of the human rights issues.
I want to talk politics on Capitol Hill. People you talk to in the base of the Republican Party are just mad. They don't understand why you can't stop the Iran deal, even though you don't have the votes to be able to do it as it's stated now. They don't get why, you know, there's all this angst about a government shutdown when you can't hold the line about something you believe in. That's what you hear out on the trail. Yeah. How do you answer those questions?
Well, first, threefold. Number one, expectations were raised unnecessarily high. This idea that you're going to win the Senate, we're going to control the agenda, just never was true. It's important to hold the Senate. We can keep a lot of bad things from happening in the Senate. But that alone is not enough. You need a president. That's why I decided to run for president. It's one of the main reasons why. We cannot change the direction of this country without the right person in the White House. So the Iran deal is a perfect example. I think we should have done a lot more early on to define its terms, to fight strongly against it, to do everything possible to derail it. But ultimately, two things need to happen. The first is people have to realize it's not a filibuster issue. It's a 67-vote veto issue. We don't have the votes to override it, so we need better senators.
What about the nuclear option on the front end?
Again, I would be open to it in something extraordinary, but at the end of the day, you're still going to need it. The result is going to be the same. The president's going to veto it, and then we need 67 votes to override it. That's why we need to elect the right president. Having Congress alone won't be enough. You need to have a president. If we have a president like Barack Obama for the next 4 years, many of the things he's put in place will become permanent, and many of the problems we have will become more difficult, if not impossible, to solve. And so this presidential election is critical. If we can hold our majorities in the House and in the Senate and elect the right person to the White House, not only can we begin to undo the damage of this administration, but we can also begin to chart a new course for the future.
So how far do you go to stand the line in what you've talked about, defunding Planned Parenthood?
Well, to me, that's not even a political issue. That's a human rights issue. People don't understand that, but to me, that's a human rights issue. They discuss it as a political issue, but to me, the sanctity of life is a human rights issue. I believe that unborn children have rights, that someone, just because they haven't born and don't have a birth certificate or haven't yet been named doesn't mean they don't have rights. And Planned Parenthood is an organization that's been caught repeatedly now on video trafficking in fetal tissue of aborted children. And it's an outrageous practice. Americans are outraged by it, and they don't understand why are we continuing to fund with taxpayer money an organization that does this sort of thing. And so what we've proposed is let's take the money that Planned Parenthood gets and let's give it to federally qualified health centers that don't do what Planned Parenthood does, but do provide women's health care, which is important. And what we should have said very early on is we're going to pass budgets that do that. And then the president and the Democrats will have to decide whether or not they're willing to shut down government over Planned Parenthood, because they're the ones that are threatening to shut down the government. It's not Republicans.
Right, but it's not spun that way.
Well, we didn't start early on. I mean, I thought it would be important for the leadership of our party to have outlined that early in the process, as opposed to basically waving the white flag and saying, well, we're going to take some votes, but we know we can't do anything about it. Again, it's an unacceptable outcome that we're now going to see. But I'll tell you this, if I'm president, we will deal with this issue. There's no reason why Planned Parenthood should be receiving federal taxpayer funding, especially after they've been exposed the way they have.
Governor Scott Walker dropped out of the race yesterday. He spent his exit speech, a lot of it talking about the need for a conservative alternative to the frontrunner, pointedly at Donald Trump. Your thoughts on Walker stepping out and his message there? Well,
first, Scott Walker is still one of the best governors in America, and he will remain governor of Wisconsin through 2018, and if he chooses to run for re-election beyond that. And he's going to continue to be a leader in our party and a leader in our country. He's just not a presidential candidate anymore, but he's still a relevant voice and an important figure in our party, and in many ways a key part of our future as a movement. As far as a conservative alternative, look, I don't view the race that way. I'm not running against anybody. I'm running for president, and that's why I've outlined a clearly detailed policy plan as early as last year. I was outlining these ideas, and I'll continue to focus on that.
So is Donald Trump qualified to be president of the United States?
Well, as I said, I think that the most important thing a president will ever do is provide for the national security of our country. And I think up to now he hasn't really answered serious questions about national security. And until he does, there should be concerns, not just about him, but about any candidate that's not able to speak in detail, with clarity, and with seriousness about the national security threats that we face. The government doesn't run the economy. The economy is run by the private sector. The job of a president is to ensure we have policies that allow the private sector to grow and prosper. But national security, the government is in charge of that. And you better have a president that understands the threats we face and what we have to do about it. And if you cannot be commander-in-chief. And so he has to meet that, as the rest of us do as well.
So is that a no?
Well, as of now, I haven't heard him talk seriously about national security. Hopefully that will change. I wish all of our candidates would speak more seriously about national security. Some have done better than others. Look, Carly Fiorina's not in government. She knows more about it than he does. So if you took the time, you could learn more about it. But ultimately, the most important thing that we need from our next president is to be someone who understands the threats we face and has real solutions to those problems. So far, he hasn't met that threshold in my mind. But, you know, there's still time, I suppose.
And last thing, for the voters out there who say, listen, we did the first-term senator thing before, someone who never made a payroll. Why should we do it again?
Well, first of all, Barack Obama is not a failure because he was a first-term senator or even for lack of experience. He now has 7 years of presidential experience, and in my mind, he's still failing. Barack Obama has failed as president because his ideas don't work, and they wouldn't have worked if he'd been in the Senate for 40 years, and they wouldn't have worked if he was the CEO of a major company, and they wouldn't have worked if he was a governor. His ideas do not work. They don't work in America. They've never worked anywhere in the world. Here's what works: free enterprise, limited government, a strong national security. That's what we need from our next president. That's what I'm running on. That's what I've always been for. That's what I have a record of working on, and that's what we're going to adjust to the realities of the century. And if we do, there's no reason why this new century can't be a new American century.
Senator, thanks for the time.
Thank you. Thanks, Brent.